I used to be of the view that if you were a clinician and you had a patient who was trying to quit but was using both cigarettes and e-cigarettes, then you should tell them to quit both. Well, that's probably not what I think is best practice. In most of our studies of nicotine replacement products, there's a big quit rate on the quit date, and then it's relapse and it's downhill from there. Whereas with e-cigarettes, the quit rate increases over time. Dual use of both cigarettes and e-cigarettes are part of the normal process.
Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. Often on this show, we have the inglorious task of sharing research findings that purport to show negative health impacts from nicotine vaping, or findings that claim deleterious social effects, such as increasing youth use of e-cigarettes, or worse, that vaping is a gateway to smoking. The sheer volume of negative research can be overwhelming, but as we reported last year, there is a concerted effort underway by prominent public health researchers to highlight better balanced research that is grounded in an honest appraisal of the relative risks of vaping versus smoking. Joining us today to discuss this effort and some of the good news out recently on vaping is Dr. Jonathan Foulds, Professor of Public Health Sciences and Psychiatry at PennState University College of Medicine. Dr. Foulds is a trained clinical psychologist and has spent most of his career developing and evaluating methods to help smokers beat their addiction to tobacco. He was a founding member and vice president of the Association for the Treatment of Tobacco Use and Dependence and has testified to FDA on behalf of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco regarding regulation of nicotine replacement therapies. Dr. Foulds, thanks for joining us today on RegWatch.
Nice to meet you.
First off, it's a question we like to ask, a lot of our first-time guests. Is there a battle being waged within public health over nicotine vaping?
Well, there's certainly a difference of opinion in our field, and some of those opinions are strongly held. I don't know if I'd call it a battle, but there are arguments on both sides it's continuing to be a debate.
What do you think lies at the heart of the discord?
Well, I think it's partly because our field, tobacco control, I consider myself part of that field, has a history of opposing the industry, because in our history, the industry has been the cigarette industry. And I think it's taken some parts of the field a little bit of time to get their head around the idea that in the evolving industry, some of the products that they are making are competing with cigarettes and are themselves meaningfully and significantly less harmful than cigarettes. And that if we can allow those less harmful products to compete with cigarettes, that ends up being a win for public health.
Tell us some more about your background. What attracted you to research on tobacco and health?
I originally trained in the UK as a clinical psychologist, and I did my PhD at University of London with the kind of famous research team on smoking at the Institute of Psychiatry in London, Mike Russell, Martin Jarvis, and I worked with Robert West in the UK. They were amongst the pioneers on early research on nicotine replacement products, the medicines to help people quit smoking. So I got into the field that way by doing my PhD with them. And I think the thing that got me kind of heavily involved in tobacco harm reduction was I was invited to give a talk in a World Health Organization meeting in Scandinavia. And, I presented a review of the literature and basically said that obviously smokeless tobacco as used in Scandinavia, snus, is significantly less harmful to users than cigarettes are. And at the time, I didn't think I was saying anything controversial. I just thought I was naive and I was young. I thought that was like an obvious statement. But because the meeting was in Scandinavia, there's a lot of people from public health in Sweden there. And even though that's really quite a public health success story in Sweden, they kind of almost violently opposed what I was saying. So it got me thinking, well, wow, what's that reaction all about? I better read more into this and make sure I'm right and that kind of thing. And myself and some colleagues published a review paper in tobacco control on that subject, which again proved to be controversial. And I don't know what was wrong with me, but I couldn't see what the controversy was. Because I ended up being involved in this debate early on, it got me kind of dragged into focusing more on tobacco harm reduction. Although my initial career and inclination is really just to help people to quit smoking, to provide treatment. But over time, the policy side and the regulatory side has really become very important, and that's what most of my research is on nowadays.
Do you think the policy side and maybe even the research side skews more to the side that is apprehensive around safer nicotine products?
Well, I mean, I've been in the US for 20 years now, and we've had FDA regulation of tobacco products for more than 10 years now. And so I see that part of it as being basically trying as much as possible to be regulating based on the scientific evidence. Now, I know some people watching this might take a gulp when I say that, because it's been a rough time for regulation of e-cigarettes, to this point in time. But I see that that's very much the aim, and that's the ethos. And although we may feel that, those of us who believe that e-cigarettes have a lot to offer in terms of delivering lower harm products, switching people from cigarettes to reduced harm products, and yet so far most of these products look as if they're going to end up being banned. I still believe that in the long run, the evidence is going to speak for itself.
In terms of being, for the health, the health benefits of vaping as opposed to smoking.
Yes. Most of the people in the field, I'm talking about researchers and public health people, I think most people accept as a fact that on an individual basis, use of an e-cigarette is much less harmful than use of a cigarette. And the NASEM report of the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine, 2010, it made that conclusion. And I think even that, those at the other side of the argument would admit that. Is when it gets into the more kind of nuanced arguments, or even the public health communications about it, that we differ. And obviously the big issue in the United States and in some other countries is the effect on kids, and how that gets weighed against the effects on existing smokers who may switch.
Dr. Foulds, is public perception poisoned over vaping?
That's a good question. It's certainly been tarnished. We now know that there have been multiple studies over the last decade, both in the United States and in other countries like the UK, showing that public perception of nicotine as on its own, finds that the public overestimate the harmfulness of nicotine. And not only is this true of the public, it seems to also be true of qualified medical doctors, the majority of whom believe that nicotine causes cancer, for example, and other smoking-caused illnesses, when the science is that that's not actually true. In fact, if you compare some of these studies, it seems like the public, on some measures, have more accurate knowledge on that than the medical doctors, which is very concerning. And the other part of it is that over time, the public's perception of the harmfulness of nicotine, and very closely related to that, the risks of e-cigarettes, is getting more inaccurate or less accurate over time. So that is a concern, but I do believe that it's possible to correct that. Unfortunately, as you work in the media, that if it bleeds, it leads. And so it's very hard to get stories into the media, into the public perception that say, hey, e-cigarettes not as harmful as people think. e-cigs less harmful than cigarettes. That's hard to get out there.
Well, wouldn't it be easy for public health, public health officials to get that message out? Because currently, this makes me think, right, is if there is misinformation that's going out there about vaping, companies that produce vaping products, companies that retail vaping products, advocates of vaping products, were very limited in their ability. You can't go out and buy national advertising. You can't go out and put a full page ad in the New York Times. So official kind of traditional ways in which you can market and get message out, industry advocates, retailers can't do that. It seems that the only avenue to official established press is through public health. So doesn't that then point to, where the problem lies?
Yeah, I believe that. I agree with that. I do feel that the FDA, who has a large budget for communications, has a role in correcting the existing misperceptions. I do believe that they could do a better job of that. I think we have to sometimes, as well as criticizing FDA and other public health colleagues, we have to put ourselves in their shoes. So, a large part of the media budget for FDA is trying to tackle the increase in youth use of e-cigarettes. 2019, it was about 27% past month use. And that, there's no way that that's going to be considered acceptable. It's gone down in the last couple of years. But if I was in their shoes, I would also see it as part of my job to focus on reducing e-cig use in youth. But I believe that once that's under control, and once we have a bunch of e-cigarette products that are authorized by FDA, then we may see a kind of what I would think of as a normalization of mass media messaging from FDA and from other public health organizations. That's what I'd hope.
Now, there are certainly a few products that FDA has granted marketing orders for as under the PMTA process. No, they're pretty much big tobacco products. Most of them are unpopular and they're all tobacco flavor only. But at least with the granting of those orders does come some ability for the companies themselves to make some kind of statements with regards to their products being appropriate for the protection of public health.
Yeah. So, but I think you're actually quite correct in the way you put it earlier, that the companies themselves are going to be very limited in what they can say, very limited, and I think they're going to be quite cautious about that if they're wise. They're not, and they're being regulated very similar to the way pharmaceutical companies are limited in what they can say about their products, maybe even more limited. So I think there is an onus on some of people in public health to try and do our best to get the truth out there. That's actually the reason that I decided to at last actually use Twitter. I had consciously avoided that because it seemed like it was a source of misinformation and frankly a lot of nonsense. But there came a point like a year or two ago where I thought there's so much misinformation out there, and I feel it's part of our responsibility to try and correct it, to try and get just the results of the science out there, so that even if we only have 10 followers, at least we've done something to put the truth out there and correct the misinformation to some extent.
Well, certainly your Twitter feed is very active. We've actually got some tweets from you that we're using in today's show. Let's jump into some of the things that you've been talking about in your feed and some of the research that you've worked on and that has come out by others in the last year. Because, it's pretty exciting that it does feel like that some movement is being made within the public health side, that a real concerted effort, whether it's, Dr. Kenneth Warner and the people he's working with and Abigail Friedman, and then, of course, the folks in the UK, there's a consistent push to try to get, more balanced research out there. So let me just ask, just so we've got it kind of on the record, in your professional opinion, are nicotine vaping products a viable option for smokers who are seeking to quit?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the evidence is clear on that. We just this year published a paper based on a trial, a randomized controlled trial that was actually for smokers who did not plan to quit, and they were randomized to either high, medium, or placebo nicotine e-cigarettes, or a cigarette substitute that didn't involve an electronic device at all. And it was for smokers who were interested in using a product to reduce their smoking. And we found that if they were given a device that delivered nicotine similarly to a cigarette, then it did reduce their exposure to toxicants from their cigarettes, even if they used the e-cig in conjunction with the cigarettes. So what we call dual use. But one interesting finding that was not really what we were doing the study for was that the people in that high nicotine e-cig group, as the trial went on, became more likely to quit, significantly more likely to quit. Now, the quit rates in this study were not high because it wasn't even a study designed to help people to quit smoking. But by 6 months later, the smokers who were randomized to the high nicotine e-cigarettes, about 11-12% of them had quit smoking completely. Whereas for the people not randomized to an e-cig or randomized to a placebo e-cig, it was between 0 and 3%. So that in itself, that shows that e-cigarettes that can deliver, importantly, it's not just any e-cigarette. An e-cigarette that can deliver nicotine efficiently and in the same ballpark as a cigarette. These ones gave slightly lower, but in the same ballpark as a cigarette. People who were not even planning to quit smoking were more likely to switch completely to the e-cigarettes. So that's it. That's one kind of trial. And I actually feel that the things that the people in that trial were trying to do and the e-cigarettes they were given, it made the trial actually not dissimilar to the way many people first try vaping. They're inquisitive. They're not making a big concerted quit attempt like they might use, a medication for. They've heard about them and they want to give them a try and they want to reduce their smoking and see. Sometimes want to see if it's a magic bullet and they can just switch to it, or just to see if it can help them reduce. And so I think the kind of people that were in our study and the outcomes were actually quite similar to people who try e-cigarettes in the first place. Slightly different from people who try a quitting trial or a medication trial who really want to quit smoking. So it was reassuring that we got that effect in that trial. And that can be added on to the other kinds of trials, like the one that Peter Hayek did in the UK, where it was almost like people who were coming to a smoker's clinic and they were randomized to nicotine e-cigarettes versus nicotine replacement therapy plus counselling. And in his trial in the UK, the people who were randomized to the e-cigarette, again, were about twice as likely to quit smoking a year later. So when you add those studies to other studies, and you look at, say, the Cochrane review of all the evidence, yeah, it's crystal clear that e-cigarettes can help smokers to quit.
So if there's so much evidence to that effect, how come it seems that this cessation issue is a point of argument within public health?
Well, I think that's because some people in the field have a bad feeling about e-cigarettes, right? They're concerned about the numbers of young people who are using them. They're concerned that there may be negative effects on health that we don't know about yet, because they've only been around for 10, 15 years. And we know, people have been in the field a long time and can remember the days where we didn't really know how bad cigarettes were, right? If you look at the history. And so I think people in our field have a bad feeling, not necessarily based on evidence, but they're requiring a lot of convincing before they say, yeah, these things can have a positive effect. And so they look for the potential negative things, like, well, we don't know the long-term effects, that kind of thing, or other arguments we hear as, well, those were trials and people who really wanted to quit, which our trial wasn't. are those are trials in people who got lots of visits and lots of appointments, which all clinical trials pretty much are, because you're trying to collect evidence and biomarkers and questionnaires. You need to see people frequently. So they look for basically an argument to say, well, it's not cut and dried yet. When I think if you look at the evidence as a totality, it's pretty clear. And it's really not surprising. These products, they're not quite the same as nicotine replacement products, but they work the same way. They deliver the same drug. They just deliver it in a way that's a little bit more like smoking. So it's really no surprise that smokers can transition to e-cigarettes more easily than they can to the patch or the gum.
Yeah, in our coverage, obviously, over the last 7 years, we've covered a lot of examples in which public health seems to look to dismiss the positive benefits of e-cigarettes, and certainly around cessation. It sounds to me that they're a bit suspicious. It's suspicious thinking.
Yes, and it is true that as of right now, we don't have the answer. Well, what's the effect of 40 years of use? We know that it typically takes decades of use of cigarettes before you see lung cancer. Okay, these haven't been around for 40 years. So some people are kind of reluctant to say, oh, we're for these, we should give them a green light. But we have to use the best evidence we have available. It's really clear that the number of toxicants that e-cigs deliver and the concentration of those toxicants is an order of magnitude. It's so much less than cigarettes. And the dose is the thing that delivers the harms that turn into serious health effects. We know that from cigarettes, and we know that from general principles of toxicology. So it would be really, really surprising if products that deliver fewer toxicants and much less of each toxicant, it would be really surprising if it didn't deliver less harm down the line. It would be bizarre.
And wouldn't it be fair to point out that if the technology and information that we had today, we had it in the 1950s, we would have been able to figure out that combustible cigarettes were deadly pretty quickly?
Yes, yeah. But, people who've been in this field a long time, they look back, they were around at the time when public health decided to say that, low tar cigarettes were less harmful. And that turned out to be a mistake. So it's kind of like trying not to make the mistakes of the past. In my opinion, it's actually making the same mistake in a different way, because e-cigarettes are nothing like cigarettes. Like cigarettes, e-cigarettes can deliver the same amount of nicotine as a cigarette. There's no need to suck harder. There's no need to get more of the bad stuff, because they can deliver it, the nicotine, which is what people smoke for, with much less toxicant exposure. And that's why they're bound to be less harmful, in my opinion. And that's what the evidence is more and more starting to show. And we've got more and more kind of I guess I would say courageous studies. Like Peter Hayek in the UK, they just published just last week a trial of e-cigarettes for smoking cessation in pregnancy, which is a pretty brief study to try and do, even from the perspective of trying to get pregnant women to even try these products. It's hard enough to even get pregnant women to use nicotine replacement products like the patch. But the results of that study were very reassuring. More women who used e-cigarettes in pregnancy quit smoking, in actual fact, and also the women who were randomized to the e-cigarettes were less likely to have give birth to offspring who were below normal birth weight. So that's one of the kind of most basic signs of harm caused by a tobacco product. That the pregnant smokers more often their babies are small for their smaller than they should be. And that was less the case for e-cigarettes than for nicotine replacement. So it's all kind of quite reassuring, in addition to the fact that they were more likely to quit smoking.
And I've got up here an article from The Guardian, which is not known to be a very pro e-cigarette paper, and it's pretty startling. E-cigarettes are as safe to use as nicotine patches for pregnant smokers trying to quit, and may be a more effective tool, researchers have revealed. I mean, that is just startling.
Yeah. And it's not, let's be very clear here, this study in itself is not going to mean we should go out and recommend pregnant women vape. I mean, this is a study for women who hadn't been able to quit already without using a product. But it does provide a lot of reassurance. It provides yet more evidence that e-cigarettes help smokers to quit, even when compared to another effective product, the nicotine patch. So I think, over time, I think the evidence is going to become more and more clear that e-cigarettes are less harmful than cigarettes, which is already pretty clear, and that they can help smokers to quit and transition to a less harmful product.
I'd like to jump back to the paper that you mentioned that you're a co-author on, which was talking about dual use, as it's one of the most mentioned issues by vaping critics. We hear it all the time. So when it comes to dual use, I mean, what is the true issue here? It feels a little bit like that these researchers don't understand the way in which smokers, the process in which they normally quit.
I think that's true. And I think, if in the study that we just published about quitting, what we showed was that with the smokers who were randomized to the high nicotine e-cigs, they didn't just quit smoking the week after they were given the e-cig. In fact, they weren't even asked to quit smoking at any point in the study, but they gradually transitioned, they gradually reduced, and they eventually quit. More so if they got a high nicotine e-cig than if they got a placebo or no e-cigarette. And I think we have to recognize that the kind of smokers who try e-cigarettes, they're not quite the same people as the ones who try a med or go for counseling. They're a little bit more hesitant. They may be more dependent, or they may be more aware that for them they get some kind of benefits, perceived benefits from nicotine. And so they're less willing to give it up completely. And so it's a different model. And I think, as you just described, that model isn't you pick a quit day and you switch completely on that day. It's far more common that it's a more gradual process. And what that means is that, in our study, it took 6 months before most of the quitters had quit. And so they're going to count as dual users for the whole of that time. And I used to be of the view myself, and this is coming from a background of doing research on smoking cessation with nicotine replacement and other products. I used to be of the view that if you're a clinician and you had a patient who was trying to quit, but was using both cigarettes and e-cigarettes, then you should tell them to quit both, right? Because it wasn't working. And these data from these various studies have convinced me that, well, that's probably not what I think is best practice. I think what's better practice to say, well, you should focus on quitting the cigarettes and using your e-cigarette more, or maybe using an e-cigarette that delivers nicotine more efficiently than perhaps the one that you're using, and cut down and and keep trying until you make it, because not everybody makes it all at once. But these studies have shown, and not just our studies, there are other studies, some of the ones published by some of the companies, like quite large population studies of people using Juul, again show that people don't just buy the product and pick a quit day and quit. And in most of our studies of nicotine replacement products, there's a big quit rate on the quit day, and then it's relapse and it's downhill from there. Whereas with e-cigarettes, the quit rate increases over time. It's quite a different pattern. And I think we have to accept that dual use of both cigarettes and e-cigarettes are part of the normal process.
Well, that's big news, because all the time we hear, in a way, it's framed that you're doing more damage to your body and to your health by dual using than if you were to just use one or the other. Like, if you're going to dual use, then you're hurting yourself.
Yeah. So, and it's tricky because, all the studies, they focus on a different population trying to do a different thing. And so it's important to be clear that the studies that we published were studies for people who were not trying to quit, but they did want to reduce their smoking. So these were people who were trying to reduce their smoking and were willing to use an e-cigarette, and they were randomized to high, medium, or placebo, or a cigarette substitute that wasn't an e-cig. So that may be a different population and might have a different outcome from people who are not trying to reduce. So we have to be careful. And there are a couple of cross-sectional studies. There were good studies who compared people who'd switched completely to e-cigs, people who were smoking, people using NRT on its own, and people who were using both cigarettes and e-cigarettes, dual users. And some of those studies did not find reductions in toxicant exposure in the dual users, okay? And they may have been people who had decided they were going to keep smoking, but they could use their e-cigarette in situations where they were not allowed to smoke and top up. And so that's the concern from public health. If many people just did that, it may not produce any health benefit, and it may actually keep people smoking for longer. And so what ultimately we have to decide and look at based on the evidence is, well, what are most people doing? Are most people trying e-cigarettes and then using both e-cigarettes and the same amount of smoking as before? Or are they using e-cigarettes and either quitting or reducing gradually over time, which is a net benefit? And my interpretation of the evidence is that on average, people who try e-cigarettes and give them a decent try, I don't mean the many people who just give it a quick, just out of interest. I'm going to, a friend gives them a cig-alike to try for the weekend. That's going to make no difference, no harm, no benefit. It's nothing. But people who really try and use it to reduce or to quit, on average, the evidence suggests that that's more likely to result in a benefit or no effect, very unlikely to result in any harm.
Well, there's certainly the phenomenon of becoming an accidental quitter.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's something that, again, it doesn't, from what I've heard, talking to e-cig users and doing research, those people who would say they're an accidental quitter, it wasn't that they bought an e-cigarette, they tried it, and they just accidentally quit on day 1 or day 2 or day 3. It was much more common that they tried an e-cigarette, they thought, oh, I like this, but it's not quite hitting the spot. I'm not convinced I can switch to it, and they'll dual use for a while. Then they'll try another one, and at some point they'll hit on an e-cigarette that actually delivers, like, it hits the spot, it delivers a bit like a cigarette, and maybe it has a flavor or some other characteristic that suits that individual. And then over time they say, I just like this as much as my cigarettes, I may as well give up the cigarettes. And then that might take a month or 6 or longer. But it certainly seems to happen. It seems to be a common thing.
I think that's a concern with all of the restrictions, banning, lack of approvals for the different variety of flavors and different devices and different nicotine concentrations, because finding that sweet spot takes some time, and for a lot of people, a lot of different variety.
Yeah. And so it's a tricky business, both for public health practitioners as a large group, or for FDA or for CDC as organizations with sort of responsibilities in this area, to decide how to deliver the messaging. And we don't want to encourage people to do both for years on end and basically dabble with e-cigarettes and continue to smoke and feel that they're somehow making a big step in the right direction, just because the evidence doesn't support that really is. Just as evidence doesn't really support that, reducing your cigarette consumption from 20 a day to 15 a day probably doesn't make any difference. You just inhale 25% more from those 15. You just compensate. So we never recommend that you reduce a little bit. But if you can really, in our trial, we asked people in the first couple of weeks to reduce their cigarette consumption by half. And then the next couple of weeks, we asked them to reduce it by 75%. And then we asked them to keep it at no more than that level and allowed them to do whatever, we didn't, if you wanted to quit, fair enough, but we didn't really suggest it. We just let them do what they wanted to do. But, it's very unlikely to do any good if you just keep smoking almost at the same rate and vaping at the same time. I think we need to tell people that it's probably not going to do you that much good at all if you just continue to smoke about the same rate. You really need to try and allow your body to learn that it can get the same satisfaction from this other product by cutting down your smoking a lot. And then one day you'll really learn that I don't really need to smoke anymore. And that's where you're going to get the health benefit.
The satisfaction, of course, of smoking and vaping is the nicotine, but nicotine's been so demonized. So what's the potential for addiction of nicotine compared to smoking and vaping?
Well, that's a tricky one to measure, but we've been studying that for a while, as have others. And the evidence in my eyes seems really consistent that e-cigarettes can be addictive, no doubt about that. But that on average, they seem to be less addictive than cigarettes. And that includes studies with different designs. So that includes studies where you take people who were cigarette smokers who switched completely to e-cigarettes, and you ask them to compare how addicted were you to your cigarettes versus your e-cigarettes. And it also looks at young people who've become either vapors or smokers, compare the addictiveness that way, and then looks at people in trials who switch to e-cigarette products. All in all, the data suggests that e-cigarettes are less addictive. Now, the surprising thing is that some of the e-cigarettes seem to be able to deliver nicotine almost as efficiently as cigarettes. And so logically, you might think, hey, these are probably going to be as addictive as cigarettes. But at least in the studies we've done and the studies we've seen, even those e-cigarettes, like the 5% nicotine pod devices that are efficient at delivering nicotine, they also seem to be less addictive, in terms of their scores on dependence measures, like the PennState e-cigarette dependence index, for example, or other measures. And so you have to think, well, what is that? Why are they less addictive? And some people have suggested, well, maybe it's because there's other things in tobacco smoke that add to the addictiveness of cigarettes. Another possibility is that because people use e-cigarettes in a different way, that actually reduces their addictiveness. So typically when people smoke a cigarette, they light the cigarette, they puff on it for 5 or 10 minutes, about 10 puffs approximately, and they got to finish it and then throw it away. This is your one shot. The thing's on fire, and at some point you've got to put it out and it's done. With an e-cigarette, things are not on fire. You don't have to finish it and then throw it away. You can vape it at any pace you like. And so what vapors tend to do, rather than be forced to take 10 puffs in 5 minutes and get quite a spike in your nicotine levels all at once, they just top up whenever they feel like it. And I think it's consistent with studies of drug delivery and addictiveness, that pattern would be expected to be less dependence forming, fewer peaks and troughs, and more just gradual satisfaction and gradual withdrawal relief in a less extreme way that you get from cigarettes.
Did I hear you correctly? Is a Juul e-cigarette at 5% less addictive than an actual cigarette? Well,
I would say the evidence suggests that's the case. For example, we've done studies where we use the same questionnaire, asking, when you're in a situation where you can't smoke, do you experience a craving? Yes or no? How when you've slept overnight, how long is it before you want to use your product in the morning, which seems to be a good measure of dependence, and things like that we know have a good track record of being related to addictiveness. We ask the same questions to vapors and to Juul users and to cigarette smokers, and it seems fairly consistent that the scores in these measures are lower on the e-cigarettes users, including the Juul users, as compared with the cigarette smokers. Now, we have to kind of look at this carefully and think, well, that's interesting. What could be the explanation for that? So one thing is, most of the measures we have in smokers are in people who smoked for decades, right? And most of the measures in e-cig users are in people who vaped for 6 months or 2 years or 5 years or whatever, but it's not decades, okay? So it could be that over time, the Juul users will become more dependent. But, we have been studying a cohort of e-cigarette users for coming on for almost 10 years now. And we've got their measures back then, we've got their measures now. And we don't see any sign that their scores are increasing over time. So that makes me less inclined to think that the reason for the lower scores and the lower dependence measurement in the e-cigarette users is that they've only been using a short time and it'll increase. It's more consistent to me with the idea that for some reason e-cigarettes are just less addictive, and all of my experience leads me to come back to, usually it's the nicotine. It's something about the way they're absorbing the nicotine. So the truth is that most e-cigarettes don't deliver nicotine as efficiently, meaning as rapidly and as high a level as a cigarette. On average, most e-cigarettes don't. Some do. And some, experienced e-cigarette users, they know how to find a device that does and how to use it in a way that they can get just as rapid nicotine as they got from a cigarette. But they tend not, on average, that tends not to be the way they use it because they don't have to. It's not like, the average e-cigarette user has to go out on a smoke break and quickly inhale two cigarettes worth, get their fix, and then go back into the office or wherever they work and abstain for 3 hours, and then their levels go down, and then they come out and they really kill that cigarette and they get a big peak. That is a profile of nicotine absorption that probably enhances the addictiveness of the drug. And we know this from studies of other nicotine delivery products. You don't see anybody addicted to the patch. Okay, why not? Because you put it on and the nicotine very slowly absorbs. So there's no behavior to connect in your brain nicotine effects with a behavior. They're totally separate. Whereas we know that nicotine gum, some people become dependent on it, but less than cigarettes. And then the nicotine nasal spray, where you sniff up your nose and it's a bit faster, that seems to be a bit more dependence forming than the gum, and much more than the patch. Well, now we have e-cigarettes that are in the same ballpark as the nasal spray, maybe even better, less unpleasant than the nasal spray. And it's no surprise that they are a bit more addictive, but still less than cigarettes.
Well, speaking as a dedicated nicotine or determined nicotine user, I can say that, a slow IV drip would be just fantastic.
Well, if only people said that about the patch, life would be easier with getting people to quit smoking. But most smokers who try the patch find that it does take the edge off their craving a bit. It just does reduce their withdrawal a bit, but they still have some craving, they still have some withdrawal, particularly the heavy smokers, and they wish they could top it up with something. And so that's why, and the evidence on the treatment side is, patch plus 4 milligram gum, or patch plus the nasal spray, or another product that you can get a bit more when you need it, is more effective. But it's kind of expensive to be buying multiple products. And many smokers, who've tried those things and it's not quite hit the spot for them, find that an e-cigarette does.
Dr. Foulds, there's a 2019 paper that you co-authored titled "What Low-Income Smokers Have Learned from Public Health Pedagogy, a Narrative Inquiry." Now, what I find fascinating about this is that it chronicles the history of tobacco control policies, the laws, the regulations, the pressure campaigns over a 50-year period. And it makes the point that the dominant societal discourse is perceived by smokers as hypocritical and has contributed to a, quote, distrust of the government, public health advocates, and healthcare providers. Tell us more about that.
So first of all, I can't really take any credit for that paper. That paper was the brainchild of Dr. Susan Veld here, who at the time was doing her doctorate, and she was part of my team, and she's now an assistant professor here at the med school. So, and she was much more open to kind of qualitative methods than I was. I'm more of a quantitative researcher, but I said, okay, that sounds worth a shot. But she really was the brainchild behind that study. And I thought, I at the end of the study, when I saw it written up, I thought, oh, that's really neat. It really helps me and I think other people in my field to get the perspective of smokers. What have they learned from being a smoker for decades, from public health, and what has really rubbed them up the wrong way. So I really, would recommend that people in my field, as well as smokers and e-cigarette users, do take a look at the paper. It's now publicly available, whereas before it was behind a paywall. But really, it showed that many smokers have kind of been rubbed up the wrong way, and have lost their trust in public health along the way. And it really kind of underlines how important it is that public health, whether it's FDA or CDC or professors or clinicians, how important it is that we really tell our patients and the public the truth. That's more important than anything else. And the end never justifies the means, in terms of we have to trust that if we tell them the truth, and we do our best to guide them to do what we think is the best step for their health based on that truth. It's much better than exaggerating the risks of things or using scare tactics, sometimes exaggerated, to put people off. I think that's one of the messages that came through from here, because over time, these people are using these products day in, day out for decades. They're listening to public health. They're hearing what their friends and colleagues say, and they become quite efficient bullshit detectors. And in fact, if you read the paper, there was a bit of salty language in the paper. It's one of the only papers I've been a co-author on that had that, because that's the way the people expressed their opinion. So I liked it, even though it's only based on a relatively small sample. I think it's a good paper for people in public health and interested in tobacco control to read, to just get a sense of how the field is perceived by smokers.
Let's turn to one of the parties that's involved in this whole debate that vapers have some suspicion of, and that's, the nonprofit public health groups, and this specifically the American Heart Association. Just recently, they put out a study in the journal Circulation that took a look at the impact of e-cigarettes and traditional cigarettes on the heart. And inside the article, they post, "We did not find a significant difference in the cardiovascular risk of exclusive e-cigarette use compared with non-use of cigarettes and e-cigarettes, although analyses were limited by a small number of CVD, which is cardiovascular disease, events in e-cigarette users." Now, to try to put this, what are they saying? Basically, they're saying there is no difference when it came to cardiovascular disease between smoking and the use of e-cigarettes. Do I have that right?
Yes, you said it correctly. You quoted their study correctly. Another part of the results was that they did find that e-cigarette users had cardiovascular risks that were 30 to 40% lower than cigarette smokers. So that's what harm reduction is, where you use a less harmful product and you get less harm. So, I on the one hand, I think we have to applaud the authors of this study for doing the study, doing the research, and I know some of the people involved, and I know that many of them are very skeptical about e-cigarettes, but they did the study and they found that e-cigarettes were no more harmful for the heart and the cardiovascular system than nothing, and less harmful than cigarette smoking. So I think we have to applaud them for reporting that honestly. And it's when you come to the
framing,
the headlines and the press releases, and this is a common theme in this field, that even when people get findings that they're not super comfortable with, they report their results accurately, generally. But when it gets to the press release, then there's a different spin put on it. And unfortunately, that was the case. The American Heart Association seemed to bend over backwards to avoid what were the key results of the study, which was that e-cigarette use was less harmful than smoking and no more harmful than nothing.
So Dr. Foulds, overall then, would you characterize some of the developments in research in this area as trending towards more balance, more good news?
Yeah, I'd say that the evidence is trending towards greater clarity that e-cigarettes can help smokers to quit smoking, which is a good thing. And it's a good thing because the evidence is also trending towards more solid evidence that e-cigarettes are significantly less harmful than cigarettes. So that's why it makes sense to switch. And the more solid and the more clear that evidence is, the more public health practitioners and clinicians will feel comfortable in sharing that information because it's based on solid grounds. And the more the public hears that, the more likely they will be to try that. So I think that's all good. As an example of that, we have a group called the Cochrane Review Group, who have a fantastic reputation for reliability in combining evidence and meta-analysis. And so over time, they update their review of e-cigarettes for smoking cessation about every 6 months. And over time, there are more studies included in their review. And over time, they've become more decisive in the language they use to say that, how clear it is. And we're now at the point where it really is very clear because we have so many studies trending in the same direction. Not every study gets a significant benefit. And so what they do is they combine all the studies, some of which might be too small to get a significant effect. And then it becomes clear when you combine them all. And so that kind of meta-analysis is the strongest evidence we can have, really, showing that e-cigarettes help smokers to quit and are less harmful.